love, trust, commitment. Words that meant everything to Marlene Carter until the day she realized they meant nothing at all. It started with a cough. Nothing serious. Just a tickle in the throat, the kind you brush off with a sip of water. But then came the fatigue, the strange weight pressing on her body like an unseen force. Something wasn't right. So she did what any responsible wife would do. She went to the doctor, expecting a simple answer. Maybe a vitamin deficiency. Maybe stress. But what she got was something no one is ever ready to hear. HIV positive. The air left her lungs. The room around her blurred. The doctor's voice faded into static. Because Marlene had been faithful. Always. And if she hadn't brought this into their home, that meant someone else had. Her husband, Darius Carter, the man who vowed to protect her, had given her more than empty promises. He had given her a death sentence. But the worst part? This wasn't just about infidelity. The truth was far more disturbing. And before this was over, Marlene would uncover secrets that would shake an entire community to its core. Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the price of betrayal. A routine checkup, a few questions, a blood draw, simple things that had never given Marlene Carter a reason to worry. She was healthy. She exercised when she could. She ate well. So when the nurse smiled and told her the doctor would be with her shortly, she barely looked up from her phone. Just another errand to check off the list. Then the door opened, and everything changed. Dr. Reynolds stepped inside, holding a manila folder, one she had seen countless times before. But this time, something was different. He didn't make small talk. He didn't smile. Instead, he hesitated, shifting the papers in his hands, as if looking for a way to soften what he was about to say. "Marlene, we need to talk." Her stomach clenched. The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter. The doctor sat across from her, his voice calm but firm. And then, two words that sent a chill down her spine. "You're HIV positive." Silence. A silence so heavy, it swallowed the air between them. Marlene blinked, her mind rejecting what she had just heard. It didn't make sense. How? Why? Her voice barely came out. That can't be right. She let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. "There's been a mistake. I don't live like that. I'm married." Dr. Reynolds exhaled slowly, nodding in that way doctors do when they've had this conversation too many times before. He reached for a second sheet of paper, sliding it toward her. The test was run twice. Same result. "I'm sorry, Marlene." Her breath came faster, uneven. The walls of the office blurred. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair, as if anchoring herself to reality. "No," she whispered. No. That's not possible." And then, the question that made her blood turn to ice. "Has your husband been tested?" The words slammed into her like a blow. And suddenly, she wasn't in the doctor's office anymore. She was back home, watching Darius walk through the front door, setting his keys on the counter, kissing her cheek. The smell of his cologne. The way he laughed at his own jokes. The late nights at work. The excuses. The trips he took without her. She had never cheated. Never once. But if she hadn't brought this into their home, that meant only one thing. Darius had. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Her world tilted. Because now, she wasn't just a wife getting bad news from a doctor. She was a woman staring down the terrifying realization that her husband had been lying to her. That the man she shared a bed with, the father of her children, had been hiding something. And that something was now inside of her. Had he known? Had he done this to her on purpose? Or was he just as oblivious as she had been? A cold shiver ran through her. She needed answers. And she needed them now. But first, she had to ask herself something even more terrifying. Did she really want to know the truth? What would you do if you were in Marlene's shoes? Would you confront him immediately? Or would you wait and gather proof? Let me know in the comments below. Marlene had always believed she knew her husband. The way he folded his shirts just so. The way he hummed under his breath while reading the newspaper. The way he wrapped an arm around her waist when they stood together at church. But now, as she watched him move through the house, something felt off. Or maybe it had always been there, hidden beneath the routine, and she was just now seeing it for what it was. That night, Darius came home at his usual time. He set his keys on the counter, poured himself a drink, smiled at her the way he always did. But for the first time in 12 years, she felt like she was standing in front of a stranger. Her mind screamed at her to ask him, to throw the test results in his face and demand the truth. But instead, she waited. She watched. She studied every movement. The way his shoulders tensed when she spoke. The way his eyes darted away when she asked how his day had been. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it something worse? Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. The words came out before she could stop them. Darius, when was the last time you were tested? The room fell silent. The glass in his hand stopped midway to his lips. Slowly, he set it down, his fingers curling around the rim as if bracing for something. Then, a pause. A long, heavy pause. Why do you ask? No denial. No laughter. No confusion. Just that one question, spoken so evenly, so carefully, that it sent a chill through her bones. Her throat tightened. She had expected anger, shock, something, anything. But not this. Just answer me. Darius exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I don't know. A while ago. How long is a while? Another pause. I don't remember. Lies. She could hear them, thick in the air between them. The same mouth that had told her, I love you, every night was now feeding her deception. She nodded slowly, forcing herself to breathe. If she pushed too hard, too soon, he'd shut down. She needed proof. She needed something he couldn't talk his way out of. So she waited. And when he finally went to bed, when the house was quiet and still, she moved. She had never searched through his things before. She had never needed to. But as she stood in their bedroom, staring at his nightstand, she knew deep down that she would find something. Something that would change everything. Her hands trembled as she pulled open the drawer. Bills. Receipts. A half-empty pack of gum. Nothing unusual. But then, at the very bottom, beneath a stack of old papers, she saw it. A small, orange prescription bottle. She picked it up, flipping it in her hand. And then, her breath caught in her throat. Tenofovir, antiretroviral medication. Her fingers clenched around the bottle. She felt like she might vomit. Her mind raced, connecting the pieces, his hesitations, his vague answers, the look in his eyes when she had asked him if he'd been tested. He knew. He had known for God knows how long. And he had never told her. She stormed out of the bedroom, the bottle clutched so tightly in her fist that her nails dug into her palm. The world felt distant, muffled. She barely heard her own footsteps pounding against the floor as she stepped into the living room, her voice sharp and shaking. Darius. He turned, his face unreadable. But when he saw what was in her hand, a flicker of something crossed his features. Guilt? Fear? Or was it something worse? She held up the bottle. What is this? For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. And when he finally spoke, his voice was maddeningly calm. I was going to tell you. She let out a bitter laugh. When? After I ended up in the hospital? After it was too late? He rubbed a hand over his face. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me, Darius. Because right now, it looks a lot like you knew you were infected, and you didn't say a damn thing. Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Marlene felt her hands shaking. She wanted him to deny it. To say it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that could still be fixed. But he just sat there, staring at her, as if searching for the right words. As if trying to decide just how much of the truth she could handle. Her breath hitched. And suddenly, she knew. Her husband wasn't just lying. He was hiding something much worse. The question was, did she really want to know what it was? If you were in Marlene's position, what would you do? Would you stay? Would you fight for the truth? Or would you walk away before it was too late? Let me know in the comments below. Suspicion is like an itch. Once it starts, it spreads, burning, consuming, until it's the only thing you can feel. Marlene couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. The thoughts clawed at her, pulling her deeper into a world she never wanted to enter. Who had done this to her? Who had been in her husband's bed? She needed answers, and she needed them now. Darius had lied to her. That much was clear. But was he still lying? Was the affair over? Or was it still happening, right under her nose? That's when the decision came to her clear as day. She would follow him. It started with small things. Watching the way he moved, how long he lingered on his phone, how quickly he excused himself when it rang. Then, one evening, an opportunity. He told her he was working late, that the prison needed him for a double shift. But Marlene knew better. Something in his voice was too rehearsed, too careful, so she waited. And when he left, she followed. For 20 minutes, she trailed his car through the dimly lit streets of Blackridge. He wasn't heading toward the prison. He wasn't anywhere near it. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel on the edge of town. The kind of place that reeked of secrecy. The kind of place where no one asked questions. Marlene's pulse pounded as she parked across the street. She gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. And then she saw her. A woman stepped out of a car parked a few spots away. Tall, confident, too familiar. Lisa Morrow, a corrections officer at Blackridge Prison, one of Darius's colleagues. Lisa walked up to him, her posture relaxed, casual, too comfortable. Darius glanced around before leaning in, speaking in hushed tones. A moment later, Lisa laughed, shaking her head. And then she did something that made Marlene's stomach churn. She touched his arm. A brief gesture. Playful. Intimate. Marlene felt her fingernails dig into her palm. So this was it. This was who he had been with. And now she had proof. But proof of what? Exactly. She needed to be sure. She needed to hear it from the source. And the next morning, she did just that. Marlene waited outside the prison, her arms folded tight against her chest. Lisa spotted her immediately, arching an eyebrow as she walked over. "You look like a woman on a mission," Lisa said, smirking. Marlene's voice was low, steady. "How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" Lisa barely flinched. If anything, she looked amused. "So, you found out. Took you long enough." Anger flared in Marlene's chest, but she held it down. "How long?" Lisa sighed, rolling her eyes. "Relax, it wasn't serious. A couple of times. We were bored." It was nothing. The word made Marlene's stomach turn. But before she could speak, Lisa did something unexpected. She laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "You really think I'm the only one?" The world around Marlene seemed to shift. The words barely registered. But when they did, they sent a chill down her spine. Lisa crossed her arms, her smirk fading. "If you think I gave him what you've got, you're wrong. I'm clean, Marlene. I don't have HIV." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Which means there's someone else." Marlene felt the breath leave her body. Because in that moment, the truth hit her like a freight train. Lisa wasn't the secret. Lisa wasn't the real betrayal. The real betrayal was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. But who was she? And how long had this been going on? One thing was certain, Marlene wasn't going to stop until she found out. If you were in Marlene's shoes, what would you do next? Would you confront Darius again? Or would you keep digging? Let me know in the comments below. Some betrayals are obvious. Others are buried so deep, so carefully hidden, that they only come to light in whispers. And sometimes, those whispers are the only warning you'll ever get. For days, Marlene had felt like she was chasing a ghost. Darius had been unfaithful. That much was clear. But Lisa wasn't the answer. Lisa wasn't the one who had changed everything. There was someone else. Someone who had left behind more than just heartbreak. Someone who had left behind a disease that could never be erased. And then, by pure chance, the answer found her. A normal afternoon. A grocery store aisle. Two women chatting near the produce section. Marlene hadn't been paying attention until she heard her husband's name. "You hear about Warden Carter?" Her body stiffened. She turned, pretending to inspect a bag of apples, ears straining. "Yeah, heard he's been real close to that Monique girl." Monique. The name meant nothing at first. But then, something clicked. The breath stalled in Marlene's throat. Monique Hayes, a 26-year-old inmate, locked up for fraud and drug-related charges. A woman with a reputation inside the prison walls. A woman known for getting what she wanted. And more than anything, a woman known to be HIV positive. Marlene felt the blood drain from her face. No, it couldn't be. He wouldn't. He couldn't be that reckless. Could he? The thought sent her reeling. She barely remembered leaving the store, barely remembered driving home. The words echoed in her mind, clawing at her sanity. Could this be the truth she had been searching for? She needed proof. And she knew exactly where to find it. That night, after Darius had gone to bed, she moved through the house in silence. She had searched his nightstand before, but she hadn't searched his work bag. The moment her fingers touched the zipper, her pulse quickened. She hesitated for only a second before pulling it open. At first, it was nothing unusual. Work documents, a prison roster, a worn-out notepad. But then, at the very bottom, tucked between files, she found them. Letters. Folded, creased from being read and reread. Marlene swallowed hard, unfolding the first one. The handwriting was small, slanted, rushed. And the words made her stomach turn. "I miss you. I think about our nights together all the time. I don't care what anyone says. You're the only one who makes me feel this way." Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the next one. "I hate when you leave. I count the hours until I see you again. You promised me you wouldn't let them transfer me. I know you can keep me here. You always take care of me." Another letter. And another. Some of them explicit. Some of them filled with desperate longing. But they all had one thing in common. They were all from Monique. Marlene's breath came in shallow bursts. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't some meaningless mistake. This was a full-blown relationship. And it had been happening behind bars. Darius hadn't just broken his vows. He had broken the law. The weight of the truth crushed down on her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to destroy everything in her path. But she didn't. Instead, she carefully folded the letters back into place. She zipped up the bag, and she turned off the light. Because now, she wasn't just a betrayed wife. She was something more. She was a woman holding undeniable proof. The only question now was, what would she do with it? If you were Marlene, would you confront him? Or would you go straight to the authorities? Let me know in the comments below. There is a moment when pain turns into something else. When grief shifts. When betrayal hardens into something sharper. For Marlene Carter, that moment came in the dead of night, sitting alone at her kitchen table, staring at the letters spread before her. Her husband had lied. He had risked her life. He had given himself to another woman, an inmate. And now, she held the proof in her hands. But what was she supposed to do with it? She imagined the confrontation, throwing the letters in his face, demanding answers. She pictured his lies, his excuses, his empty apologies. And for the first time, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want an apology. She wanted revenge. The rage inside her burned like a living thing. It wasn't enough to leave him. It wasn't enough to scream or cry or throw his things onto the lawn. She wanted him to suffer. The way she had suffered. The way he had made her feel small, helpless, like a fool. She imagined telling the world, dragging his name through the mud, letting everyone know what kind of man he really was. But even that wasn't enough. Because Darius Carter wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a man who had broken the law. And for that, he needed to pay. She picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered over his number, temptation pulling at her. But then, a new thought struck her. One that made her heart beat slow. One that made her breath steady. She didn't have to call him. She didn't have to hear his voice. She could call someone else. The next morning, she made her decision. She drove to a quiet parking lot where no one would recognize her. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd have to use. A steady voice answered. Blackridge Correctional Facility, Internal Affairs. Marlene swallowed hard. Then, with a voice like steel, she said the words that would change everything. I need to report a crime. The silence on the other end stretched for a moment. Then, the officer spoke. Go on. Marlene took a breath. My husband is Warden Darius Carter. He's been having an affair with an inmate. I have proof. The next few minutes moved in a blur. Questions. Details. A meeting set for later that afternoon. And then, the final confirmation. Ma'am, you understand the seriousness of this? Marlene closed her eyes. She had spent years standing by Darius's side, protecting him, defending him. But now, she was done. Her voice didn't waver. Yes, I do. And with that, the wheels were set in motion. She wasn't going to suffer in silence. She wasn't going to be another forgotten victim of a cheating husband's lies. No, she was going to burn his entire world to the ground. But the real question was, how would Darius react when he found out? If you were Marlene, would you have made the call? Or would you have handled it another way? Let me know in the comments below. Secrets have a way of unraveling. No matter how deeply they're buried, no matter how carefully they're concealed, the truth always finds a way to the surface. And for Darius Carter, the moment of reckoning had arrived. It happened in their living room. The same place where they had spent countless nights as a family. The same walls that had once echoed with laughter now stood witness to something much darker. Marlene had waited for him to return home. She hadn't spoken a word when he walked through the door, hadn't let her expression betray the storm brewing inside her. But when he turned to face her, he saw it. She wasn't the same woman he had left that morning. She held the letters in her hands, her fingers gripping the crumpled pages. Her voice was eerily calm. Sit down, Darius. He hesitated, scanning her face for an opening, some way to talk himself out of whatever was coming. But there was none. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the couch, his eyes darting toward the papers in her hand. She dropped them onto the table between them. One by one, the proof of his betrayal lay exposed. Monique Hayes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's who you risked everything for. Darius swallowed hard, but he didn't deny it. He didn't bother pretending anymore. He knew it was over. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. She seduced me, Marlene. I didn't mean for this to happen. Marlene let out a sharp laugh, a sound that held no amusement. You didn't mean for this to happen? Her voice rose, sharp and unsteady. Didn't mean for what? To cheat? To infect me? To destroy our family? Darius's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, rubbing his hands together, searching for the right words. Words that could fix what was already beyond repair. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he muttered. I never wanted you to find out. Marlene's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. That was what he cared about. Not the betrayal, not the consequences, but the fact that she had found out. You never wanted me to find out? She repeated, her voice shaking. That's what you're saying to me right now? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was enough. Marlene felt something inside her shatter. There was no remorse in his face, no true regret, just the weight of being caught. And in that moment, she knew this wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the man she had loved for over a decade. That man no longer existed. And if there was any doubt left, his next words erased it completely. You need to let this go, Marlene, he said, his voice low, almost warning. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something much bigger, something much darker. And she wasn't sure if she had just uncovered the truth, or if she was only scratching the surface. What would you have done in Marlene's place? Would you have kept pushing for the truth? Or would you have walked away before things got even worse? Let me know in the comments below. Justice moves slowly, but when it comes, it arrives like a storm, sudden, undeniable, and unstoppable. For Darius Carter, the storm had finally reached his doorstep. The arrest happened early in the morning. A knock on the door. the kind that isn't a request, but a command. Marlene sat in the kitchen, unmoving, as voices filled the house. The sound of handcuffs locking into place, the heavy shuffle of boots on the hardwood floor. And then his voice, sharp, angry, but laced with something else. Fear. Marlene. Marlene, what did you do? She didn't answer. She didn't move. She just listened as her husband, the man who had once held power inside a prison, was now the one being dragged away in chains. By the time the trial began, the case had become a spectacle. The media swarmed outside the courthouse, reporters eager to cover the scandal of a respected warden who had not only betrayed his wife, but had broken the very laws he was sworn to uphold. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Officers from Blackridge sat in the gallery, their faces unreadable. Family members whispered among themselves. And at the center of it all, Darius Carter sat at the defendant's table, his face set in stone. But if there was one moment that silenced the room, it was when Marlene took the stand. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded carefully in her lap. But when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every betrayal, every sleepless night, every moment she had spent wondering if the man she loved had knowingly condemned her to a life she never chose. He was supposed to protect me, she said, her voice steady. Instead, he gave me a death sentence. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Darius sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. But he didn't look at her. He hadn't since the moment she walked in. Then came the moment no one had expected. Monique Hayes, the inmate at the center of it all, was called to testify. She entered in handcuffs, her prison uniform neatly pressed, her expression unreadable. But when she spoke, her voice was unwavering. I loved him, she said simply. He told me he loved me too. Marlene didn't flinch. She had prepared for this moment. She had spent nights wondering how Monique saw it, how she justified the affair, the risk, the destruction left in its wake. And now, here was the answer. Love. That's what Monique believed it was. Even as she admitted how they met in secret, how he had pulled strings to keep her close, how he had whispered promises that would never come true. She believed it had meant something, but in the end, the law didn't care about love. The evidence spoke louder. The letters, the surveillance footage from the prison infirmary, the medical reports, the testimony from fellow officers who had heard rumors but never dared to speak up until now. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift. Guilty, misconduct, endangering his spouse, engaging in illegal relations with an inmate, abuse of power. The list was long, and when the judge read the sentence, the courtroom held its breath. 15 years, behind the same bars he had once used to control others. Darius Carter barely reacted. He stood still as the bailiff approached, as the cuffs clicked around his wrists once more. But just before he was led away, he turned. His eyes met Marlene's for the first time since his arrest. And for the briefest moment, something flickered there. Not anger, not regret. Something deeper. A realization that he had lost. That everything he had built, everything he had controlled, was now gone. But Marlene? She didn't look away. She met his gaze, unwavering, because she was no longer the woman who had sat across from him in their living room begging for the truth. She was no longer the woman who had once believed in his promises, his lies, his carefully constructed life. She was something else now, a survivor. And as she walked out of the courtroom that day, stepping into the sunlight, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. If you were in Marlene's position, would this verdict be enough? Or do you think justice should have gone further? Let me know in the comments below. The trial was over. The verdict had been read. Darius Carter was no longer a free man. But justice is never simple. And for Marlene, the sentence he received would never erase the damage he had done. 15 years. That's what the judge had decided. 15 years behind the very bars he had once patrolled with authority. But was it enough? Some believed it was. A warden abusing his power, violating the very institution he was meant to uphold. 15 years in prison was a fitting end. Others weren't so sure. They whispered in the streets, in church pews, in quiet corners of the town. He should have gotten more. If it were the other way around, would she have gotten off so easy? And then there were those who saw it differently, who looked at Marlene not as a woman scorned, not as a victim, but as something else entirely. She should have stayed, some murmured. Forgiven him. Marriage is sacred. Forgiveness. It was a word Marlene had heard too often in the weeks after the trial. People telling her that hate would only consume her, that in time she would have to let it go. But those people didn't wake up every morning knowing their life had been altered forever. Those people didn't live with the weight of a diagnosis that had come not from reckless mistakes of her own, but from a man she had once trusted more than anything. HIV. A reality that could not be undone. A sentence far greater than the one Darius had received. She had moments, dark ones, where the weight of it all threatened to crush her. But she refused to be destroyed. I should have been broken, she later admitted. But I chose to fight. She focused on healing, on reclaiming her life, her identity, her sense of control. She joined support groups, became an advocate for women who had been deceived and infected by their partners. She spoke out, loudly, publicly. Her story was no longer just her own. It was a warning, a lesson, a voice for those too afraid to speak. Meanwhile, Darius sat behind bars. His world, once filled with power and authority, was now reduced to steel doors and concrete walls. He had ruled the prison as warden. Now he was just another inmate, another number, another man with nothing left but time. And Monique? She remained where she had always been, on the inside. Her role in the scandal had given her notoriety among the inmates, but it also made her a target. In the end, whatever love she thought she had with Darius was nothing more than another lie, another fantasy built on stolen moments and whispered promises that would never come true. The town moved on. People stopped talking. The headlines faded. But for Marlene, the story wasn't over. Because justice is never just about punishment. It's about closure. It's about healing. It's about finding a way to move forward when the past still lingers like a shadow. So the question remains, was justice served? Or did Darius get off easy? Should he have faced a harsher sentence? Should Marlene have forgiven him? What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments below. Some betrayals cut deeper than others. Some crimes don't just steal lives. They steal trust, dignity, and the very sense of security a person once had. Marlene Carter's story is not just about infidelity. It's not just about a prison scandal. It's about deception at the most personal level. A violation of body, mind, and soul. A crime that left wounds no prison sentence could ever fully heal. But what do you think? Was Darius Carter's punishment enough? Should Monique have faced charges as well? And what would you have done in Marlene's place? Would you have fought for justice or walked away from the wreckage and started anew? This case is one of the most chilling betrayals we've ever covered. If you found this story shocking, make sure to subscribe for more true crime cases that will leave you speechless. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware. And remember, sometimes the real danger comes from the ones we trust.